When Harriet Goss called the man refilling her water glass a career floor polisher with a name tag and no prospects, she said it clearly enough for the tables on either side to stop their own conversations entirely. Russell Birch set the pitcher down without a tremor, studied her face for exactly 1 second, and asked in a tone so level it barely disturbed the air between them whether she still planned to be in the conference room by 9 o'clock the following morning. Harriet Goss blinked. Then she laughed, a sharp, practiced sound that told the room she found the question amusing in the way a person finds a child's joke amusing. Her chief operating officer, Burton Frey, chuckled along beside her. The two of them had flown in from Atlanta that afternoon to finalize a licensing agreement worth $85 million, and neither of them knew yet that the man they had just dismissed was the only person on Earth who could authorize that agreement to move forward. If you want to see what happened the moment they figured that out, stay with this story until the very end. Russell Birch spent the last 90 minutes before his evening shift the way he spent most evenings, standing at the counter of a 2-bedroom apartment in South Columbus, browning onions in a cast-iron pan, while his 17-year-old daughter, Celia Birch, sat at the kitchen table behind him pretending to read a novel and actually watching him cook. Celia had her mother's habit of doing that, the quiet observation that looked like something else, and Russell had long since stopped pretending not to notice. He told her the rice would be another 15 minutes. She told him she already knew that. They ate dinner together the way they had eaten every dinner for the past 4.5 years. Without ceremony and without silence, the two of them filling the space around the table with the kind of easy, unhurried conversation that only survives in households where people have genuinely chosen to be present with one another. 4.5 years was how long it had been since Russell's wife, Patricia, had died. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed in February, gone by August. Russell had taken a leave of absence from his engineering position at a regional freight consulting firm during those 6 months and never gone back. The work had felt impossible to return to afterward, not because it was painful, but because the version of himself who had done that work belonged to a life that no longer existed. He needed something that would hold him to a schedule without demanding anything from the part of his mind that was still sorting through what remained. A friend mentioned the Langford, a private dining establishment near downtown that was known for hiring people who understood how to be invisible when the room called for it and present when it didn't. Russell applied on a Tuesday. He was working the floor by Thursday. He had not planned to build anything during those first months. The software that would eventually become VeriFlow began as a set of notes kept on legal pads during his breaks, observations about inefficiencies in the freight routing models he had spent a decade studying, patterns that appeared consistently across carriers of every size, and that no existing audit platform addressed in a way that actually protected smaller operators from being crushed by algorithmic misclassification. He refined it late at night after Celia went to bed, first in a shared repository with no collaborators, then with 2 engineers he trusted, then with a small and careful team that worked remotely and understood that the platform was built around a single non-negotiable principle. The data would never be weaponized against the people it was meant to protect. By the time Meridian Freight Solutions began pursuing a licensing agreement, VeriFlow was already in use by several mid-sized carriers across the Midwest, and the results were not ambiguous. Supply chain fraud had dropped in every network that deployed it. Small independent operators were flagging errors that would previously have gone unnoticed until those operators were already out of business. The platform worked exactly the way Russell had designed it to work, quietly and in favor of whoever needed it most. The $85 million that Meridian was now offering was not a surprise to him. It was simply a number attached to something he had already known had value. He had asked Desmond Cole, his attorney and one of the few people who knew the full picture, to keep Russell's identity out of negotiations until the final signing. Not because Russell was ashamed of either of his lives, but because he had seen enough boardroom behavior to know that people treated the unknown owner of a valuable technology differently than they treated the man carrying their dessert plates. He wanted to see how Harriet Goss conducted herself when she believed no one at the table was watching. He had his answer before the entrees arrived. The Langford occupied the first 2 floors of a converted early 20th century building near the Arts District. The kind of place that had been quietly excellent for so long that it no longer needed to announce itself. The dining room held 22 tables. The walls were old brick. The lighting was warm without being theatrical, and the staff moved through the space with the kind of unhurried confidence that came from knowing the room well enough to anticipate what would be needed before it was asked for. Margaret Osey, who had owned the Langford for 11 years, and who had known Russell since he first walked through the door, pulled him aside before the Meridian party arrived to tell him the booking had expanded from 4 guests to 9, which meant she needed him on that section all evening. Russell thanked her and went to check the setup at table 7. He was reading the wine list near the service station when the Meridian group came through the front doors, and he recognized Harriet Goss immediately from photographs attached to deal correspondence he had reviewed with Desmond earlier in the week. She was in her mid-50s, efficient in her movements, and she dismissed the hostess's greeting with a small gesture that managed to be simultaneously polite and completely indifferent. She evaluated the room in approximately 4 seconds and seemed to find it adequate, which was the most generous response the Langford generally received from people like her. Russell approached the table as he had approached 10,000 tables before it, calmly and without any of the information he was carrying visible on his face. He introduced the evening's first course offering. Harriet Goss looked through him the way people look through windows. She asked for a wine that was not on the list. When Russell explained that the bottle she had named was reserved for a private event earlier in the week and had not been restocked, she informed him, with a patience that was clearly meant to suggest she found patience itself exhausting, that she did not come to establishments like this one to be told what was unavailable. Burton Frey added that service of this caliber ought to come with fewer restrictions on what a guest was permitted to order, which produced a brief ripple of appreciative laughter from the other Meridian executives at the table. Russell recommended an alternative with similar characteristics and a higher rating from the Cellar Review run that month. Harriet told him to bring it, which he understood to mean she did not want to discuss it further. The evening proceeded in the way these evenings sometimes do when a table contains someone who has mistaken visible power for unconditional authority. Harriet changed her order twice without apology. She pointed out that a water glass had been refilled from the wrong side, which was not actually incorrect procedure at the Langford, but which Russell acknowledged without argument. When a younger server named Alma set a breadbasket a few inches closer to Burton Frey than to Harriet, Harriet told Margaret, who was passing the section, that she would prefer if the newer staff were reassigned for the remainder of the evening. Margaret thanked her for the feedback and said nothing else. Russell quietly rerouted Alma to a different section before Harriet could press the issue further, sparing the younger woman the specific humiliation of being publicly repositioned as though she were furniture arranged incorrectly. At some point during the 3rd course, Burton Frey made a comment about small carrier routing efficiency that contained a factual error large enough that Russell, whose entire professional life had been correcting exactly this category of mistake, could not let it sit unchallenged. He offered the correction gently, in the manner of someone clarifying rather than contradicting. The table went briefly quiet. Harriet Goss set down her fork and looked at Russell, with an expression that suggested she had found the intervention both remarkable and deeply unwelcome. "You carry wine for a living," she said. Not loudly. She did not need to be loud. "Whatever you think you know about how freight logistics works, I promise you it's not relevant to this table." Russell did not respond to that. He refilled the nearest glass, excused himself, and returned to the service station. He was halfway through setting up the dessert tray when he heard Harriet's voice lift above the room's ambient tone. She was describing him to the table. The man with the apron and the opinions, she called him. And the account she was giving was not cruel exactly, just reductive in the particular way that certain people use reduction as a substitute for engagement. She said she supposed that people who ended up in service had usually run out of more interesting options. She said it almost fondly, the way someone says something they have said many times before and have long since stopped examining. Russell walked back to the table. He set down the check folder. He looked at Harriet Goss and said, very quietly, that he hoped she was rested for the morning, because his understanding was that the licensing terms still had several open items requiring her personal approval. Harriet's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree. "Excuse me?" "The Veriflow agreement," Russell said. "Your counsel was planning to walk through the supplier protection clauses at 9. I assumed you would want to be alert for that portion." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Burton Frey's face did something complicated, and the woman seated to Harriet's left, Meridian's general counsel, Simone Ward, looked up from her phone for the first time in an hour. It was Desmond Cole who walked through the front door of the Langford. At that moment, his coat still on, his expression carrying the particular tightness of a man who has recently understood something he cannot ununderstand. He crossed the dining room without stopping and arrived at table 7 and looked at Russell and then at Harriet Goss and said, in the straightforward the way people say things when they have decided that gentleness is no longer the priority, "Ms. Goss, the man standing at your table is Russell Birch. He is the founder of Birch Systems and the sole rights holder of Veriflow. He is the only person authorized to sign tomorrow's agreement." Harriet Goss did not move for a moment. The Meridian executives around her went through a sequence of expressions that ranged from confusion to alarm. Simone Ward opened the folder she had been carrying all evening, compared the identification photograph inside it against the man standing across the table, and put the folder back down without a word. Russell untied his apron and folded it over his arm. He told Harriet, without any particular ceremony, that he had worked at the Langford for most of the past 5 years, that this was not a performance designed to test anyone's character, and that what he had observed tonight was not a single misguided comment but an entire evening of behavior that suggested she believed her position entitled her to treat anyone in a service role as something less than fully human. Dazed voice. He did not raise his voice. He did not look for a reaction. He said what he had to say and waited. Harriet's response was immediate and pragmatic. She offered to increase the deal by $7 million. She offered a personal apology in whatever format Russell preferred. She suggested the evening's events could reasonably be framed as a misunderstanding attributable to the stress of travel. Russell declined each offer in turn and told Desmond to send the formal notice of withdrawal from negotiations with Meridian Freight Solutions. Harriet Goss leaned forward before she stood and told him, quietly and with a composure that had not entirely broken, that he had just made a decision he would not be able to reverse, and that she would personally ensure the freight industry understood exactly what kind of partner Russell Birch was. He watched her walk out of the Langford. The room held its breath, and then, slowly, returned to itself. What followed in the next several weeks was not the clean reversal that a simple story might offer. Harriet moved quickly. Within 48 hours, a coordinated set of statements had appeared in trade publications describing Russell as an erratic inventor whose personal grievances had compromised a deal that dozens of carriers and hundreds of employees had been counting on. The framing was precise. Birch was characterized not as someone who had walked away from a bad partnership, but as someone who had withdrawn from a good one because his ego had been bruised at a routine business dinner. The fact that he worked nights as a floor server was presented as evidence of irrelevance rather than discipline, and several Birch Systems investors received direct calls from Meridian contacts suggesting that the platform's commercial viability had always been overstated. Margaret Osie's dining room was hit within the week. Organized one-star reviews appeared online in a pattern any observer could have identified as coordinated. And two long-standing corporate accounts canceled standing reservations after receiving calls from people in Meridian's network. Margaret did not mention the financial toll to Russell directly, but he saw it in the way she began staying later, reviewing the bookings on her phone at the host station with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out in her favor. Celia noticed the change in her father the way she noticed most things, quietly, without making it into something it didn't need to be. She asked him one evening while they were washing dishes whether the people he was dealing with were actually dangerous or just very inconvenient. Russell told her they were the second kind, but were working hard to become the first. She thought about that for a moment, and then asked whether he was still sure he had made the right call. He said he thought so. She said she thought so too, and went back to drying the pan in her hands, and that was the end of the conversation. He did not tell her yet about what he and Desmond had found in Meridian's due diligence documents. The file had arrived through Simone Ward, sent late at night to Desmond's personal email with a subject line that read only, Appendix D. You should read this before you form any more opinions about what happened. Inside was Meridian's complete implementation plan for Veriflow, not the version shared during negotiations, but the internal version reviewed and approved by Harriet Goss, 3 months before any licensing discussion had formally begun. The plan called for Veriflow's misclassification flags to be applied automatically to any carrier falling below a threshold that Meridian's own compliance team had helped design specifically to catch small independent operators. These carriers would not be contacted or given any opportunity to correct an error before their contracts were suspended. Legal liability for any disruption in the supply chain would be redirected to the carrier, not to Meridian. Buried in a subsection of the appendix was a projection. Within 14 months of full deployment, Meridian anticipated acquiring the route contracts of more than 400 independent carriers who could not survive a suspension of even 60 days. Veriflow had been built to protect exactly those carriers. Harriet had known that. She had read the platform's documentation carefully enough to see precisely how it could be inverted. Russell sat with that document for a long time. The apartment was quiet. Celia was asleep. The only sound was the refrigerator cycling on and off in the kitchen, a sound he had stopped hearing years ago and now heard again very clearly. He thought about the engineers on his team who had spent nights writing the appeals module, the part of Veriflow specifically designed so that a small carrier, flagged by the algorithm, could challenge the decision and be heard by an actual person before any action was taken. That module had been listed in the appendix as a feature to be deprioritized pending operational review, which meant it would have been quietly removed and never restored. He called Desmond at 6 in the morning. Desmond was already awake. Meridian's next move was a press announcement. Harriet appeared at a scheduled industry conference and unveiled what she described as an internally developed routing audit platform that Meridian's own engineering team had built in response to the collapse of the Veriflow deal. She referred to Russell once briefly as a cautionary example of what happened when an amateur inventor mistook personal conflict for professional principle. The platform she demonstrated contained code that Russell's engineers identified within 72 hours. Embedded in an early generation module was a sequence Russell had inserted as a proprietary marker in a prototype shared with a third-party consultant during preliminary testing 2 years prior. The marker was not accidental. It was the kind of only Russell would know to look for, because he was the only person who knew it was there. Desmond filed the technical findings with a forensic analysis firm the following morning. Simone Ward, reached through a mutual contact, confirmed that she had preserved the internal implementation plan on Meridian's own legal servers and had not altered it in any way. She could not testify publicly, she said, but she could make certain that what existed could not be made to disappear. The Meridian board convened a special session 3 weeks after the press conference. Russell arrived at the building in a gray suit. He had owned for 6 years, rode the elevator to the 14th floor, and walked into a conference room where Harriet Goss was already seated at the far end looking at him with the expression of someone who has prepared extensively for a conversation they expect to control. She said, when he sat down, that she hoped he understood this was not the place to continue whatever personal dispute he believed they were having. Russell said he understood exactly what the meeting was, and that he was grateful for the opportunity to make sure the board understood it as well. Desmond presented the evidence in sequence: the internal implementation plan, the projected carrier casualties, the disabled appeals module, the proprietary code marker, and the chain of custody that traced the stolen architecture from a consultant firm controlled by Burton Frey back to Meridian's internal development team, the coordinated review campaign tied to Meridian's communications contractors by metadata and timing, and a recording recovered from Meridian's own server archive by Simone Ward, in which Harriet's voice, unmistakable and unedited, instructed her technical team to use the extracted architecture to build quickly, before Birch Systems ran out of capital to fight a lawsuit. Harriet denied the recording's authenticity. Burton Frey, who had been watching his options narrow for 40 minutes, said quietly that he had carried out every instruction under direct authorization and that he had documentation to that effect. Simone Ward, who had entered the room during the evidence presentation, confirmed the recording was genuine and that its provenance could be verified against Meridian's own server logs. The board members were silent for a long time. Russell let the silence settle. Then he told them that the opportunity to license Veriflow through Meridian no longer existed. He had signed a different agreement that morning. He explained that Birch Systems had entered an exclusive licensing partnership with the Summit Carrier Network, a cooperative of independent freight operators representing more than 300 carriers across 22 states. The agreement was worth $98 million. It preserved every protection clause his team had written into the platform's original design. No automatic suspensions without a human review period. A functional appeals process with a guaranteed response window. Equity participation for the engineers who had built Veriflow from scratch. A rolling audit right retained by Birch Systems to monitor how the data was being used, and a hard prohibition against using the algorithm to acquire route contracts from carriers the system had flagged. He had chosen the Summit Carrier Network not because the number was higher, though it was, but because the platform would finally do what he had spent 5 years designing it to do: catch fraud without becoming one. The Meridian board voted that afternoon. Harriet Goss was suspended immediately under the company's for-cause termination provisions. Burton Frey was placed under a separate investigation. The International Expansion Project, the $85 million agreement had been the centerpiece of, collapsed within days as counterparties withdrew. And the stock movement that followed made every board member in that room acutely aware of how much a single executive's certainty in her own impunity had cost the company and everyone connected to it. Margaret Osey opened the Langford's Kitchen to a private event 6 weeks later. A small gathering for the Summit Carrier Network's founding team. And some of the independent operators whose contracts had nearly been stripped by an algorithm they never knew was being aimed at them. Russell arrived early to help set up, which Margaret accepted without comment and without ceremony. The way she accepted most of the things Russell did that other people found unusual. Celia came with him. She stood near the kitchen pass-through for most of the evening, watching her father move through the dining room with the quiet competence he had carried into every shift for the past 5 years, and she looked at him with an expression that Russell caught only once, briefly, before she went back to talking to one of the junior engineers from his team. Later, after the guests had gone and the room was being cleared, she asked him why he had done all of this. The gathering, the summit agreement, all of it, when he could have simply taken the Meridian money and been finished with it. Russell set down the tray he was carrying and thought about that for a moment. Because the people in this room tonight didn't have anyone in the room at Meridian, he said. They needed someone who knew what was in that appendix and was willing to care about it. Celia considered that. That's a pretty expensive thing to care about. It was, he said, but the alternative was being someone who knew and didn't. She didn't answer right away. She picked up the other end of the tray and helped him carry it toward the kitchen, and the conversation ended there, but he understood from the way she held herself that she had heard him in the way that mattered. A new board was appointed at Meridian within the month. The incoming CEO reached out to Russell through counsel and offered $110 million to reconsider a partnership under entirely restructured terms. Russell reviewed the offer with Desmond, thanked them for their time, and declined. His agreement with the Summit Carrier Network was not something he had entered into as a negotiating position. It was something he had built toward for 5 years without knowing it. The same way he had built most of the things that turned out to matter, quietly, without announcing it, and in full confidence that the work itself would say whatever needed to be said. He still worked occasional evenings at the Langford, not every week, not even every month, but sometimes, when Margaret needed him and the evening felt right, he would put on the same apron he had worn the night. Harriet Goss told him that a man in service had no business speaking at her table. He did not do it to make a point. He did it because he had never once believed that the worth of a person's life was calculated by the distance they managed to put between themselves and honest work. On one of those evenings, a guest near the window flagged him down with a gesture that made clear he was accustomed to immediate responses from the people around him. Russell crossed the room, took the order, and returned to the kitchen without any trace of the encounter registering on his face. Margaret caught his eye from across the room and smiled. The kind of smile that didn't require a reason and didn't need one. Outside, the city moved in the direction it was always going, and Russell Birch, who had spent years learning that a person's dignity was not something that could be assigned by title or revoked by contempt, walked back across the dining room floor with a tray in his hands and no need at all to explain himself to anyone who might not understand.